In order to rally people, governments need enemies. They want us to be afraid, to hate, so that we will rally behind them. And if they do not have a real enemy, they will invent one in order to mobilize us. Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have Scott Horton of antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute. Please check out his excellent book, Fool's Errand: Time to End the War in Afghanistan. Scott, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Always great to be with you, Keith.
Thank you. So before getting into Afghanistan, please explain the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Are these one groups that have a sibling rivalry? Are they separate groups? What is going on there?
Totally different groups. So briefly, in the 1980s, actually beginning in 1979 under Jimmy Carter and then through the Reagan years, America backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which was primarily a Pashtun movement, but also included some of the other ethnicities, fighting a guerrilla war against the Soviet-backed communist government and, in fact, the Soviet invasion of the regular Soviet army that had invaded the country in Christmas of 1979. Now, as part of that whole effort, America cooperated with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan to funnel not just aid to the Afghan Mujahideen, but a group of fighters, well, many different groups of fighters, that became known as the Arab Afghans. And these were essentially extremists and radicals and criminals and people that the regimes of especially the Arab world in the Middle East would like to get rid of. They're kind of dangerous to keep around, so we'll send them all off to Afghanistan to go and fight. And you had guys from especially Saudi Arabia, but also Libya and Syria and all around the Middle East, Palestinians, a few of them anyway, prominently among them. They're one of the major leaders of the Arab Afghans was a guy named Abdul Azam, and Osama bin Laden, the, I guess, 10th son or whatever it is of the Saudi bin Laden clan, which they're basically like a Rockefeller family, or more like maybe like a Halliburton type situation. They do big construction jobs for government. So what Halliburton was to Lyndon Johnson and George W. Bush is, what the bin Laden group is to the Saudi royal family, if that makes sense there. And bin Laden then not just went with his money and guns, but with construction equipment and all of these very useful things for helping the Mujahideen dig in and, have their safe areas for their war with the Soviets. Then so now we'll go from here. At the end of the war, the Arab Afghans mostly went home. We'll get back to them in a second, but let's stick with Afghanistan for a minute. When the Soviets left Afghanistan, the place was taken over by all fighting warlords, mostly from the victor's side, but also some communists like General Dostum. But mostly from the victor's side, you had guys like Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and these others who were these brutal, vicious, criminal, rapist, murderer warlords. I mean, Hekmatyar was known for skinning people alive. And in fact, Hekmatyar and Haqqani were both two of the CIA's very favorites in the 1980s war. And these men then fought a civil war from the early 90s through about 1996, fighting a brutal war over control of the capital. And essentially, there were no decent men with power anywhere in the country. It was all the most brutal criminals and warlords. So this is where the Taliban came to power. Now, some of them had been veterans of the war, but they were not the bosses of the war. They were not the Mujahideen. These were the guys who, many of them, their rank and file, had been children raised in the refugee camps in Pakistan. They were Afghans, but they had not fought in the war. Many of them were too young to have fought in the war while their leaders had fought. But these guys essentially, I think the common conception, sometimes the mistaken conception is, these are the guys that America backed in the war. But really, these are the guys who were the solution to the guys that America backed in the war in the 1980s. And they came and essentially they rose to power arresting warlords for rape and murder, for crime. And so that was how they came to power, was like a righteous holy war crusade, where they were essentially, of course, corrupt at the top. They were a fledgling government, but at the same time, they instituted real law and order. And so they had an absolute zero tolerance policy against low-level crime. So they created real security for the average people and created a huge movement of support behind them. And of course, Bill Clinton helped support that. The Clinton government in the 1990s, along with the Saudis and the Pakistanis, said, you know what, we prefer this new Taliban movement to our old friend Carter and Reagan's Mujahideen guys who are so chaotic. And they wanted to build an oil pipeline, famously the Unocal oil pipeline from Turkmenistan across Afghanistan and through the mountains down to the port of Karachi, I guess tunnel under the mountains and down to the port of Karachi. Well, this is a crazy fantasy. It's never going to happen because of the security situation there. But that was why they supported the Taliban. And as I show in my book, Fool's Errand, the Clinton government didn't just support the Taliban. They wanted to see the Taliban win an unconditional victory over the Northern Alliance enemy so that they would have a true monopoly on power over the entire nation, over the entire country, their state would, and then they could guarantee the security of the pipeline. And so America, Saudi, and Pakistan backed the rise of the Mujahideen, who, again, these are local Pashtun tribesmen who came to power as a counter to all the chaos that had been caused by America's guys in the first place. Then the American government backed them. Okay, now at the same time, our Arab Afghan fighters have gone home, right? But now they have new battles to fight. And by the way, they have no other job skills except killing people and blowing up things. And so they're basically a bunch of mercenaries with no jobs. And America immediately gives them a reason to turn against us. After backing them all those years in Afghanistan, America not only occupies Saudi Arabia to wage Iraq War I against Iraq to force them out of Kuwait in 1991, but they stayed, and they stayed forever. And this was bin Laden's complaint that got him, he publicly denounced the king and was exiled from the country for doing so, and began to take what had been Abdullah Azzam's group that I had mentioned there, one of the major leaders of the Arab Afghans, and he merged his group with Ayman al-Zawahiri's group. He was the Egyptian surgeon from Cairo and the leader of Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And they merged the Azzam group and Egyptian Islamic Jihad together on the basis that we're going to merge together in order to focus our fight on the United States of America, as they put it, the far enemy. Now, again, these are not Pashtuns from Afghanistan. These are Arabs from Saudi Arabia and Egypt who had fought in the war, who were veterans of the Afghan war, but had their own, more immediate concerns. So why focus on the middle part of North America to force us all to, change to their religion and outlaw R-rated movies and stuff? No, that's not what it was. It was that America is the world empire. And America supported, of course, the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and the monarchy, the dictatorship of King Fahd in Saudi Arabia. And so, and for that matter, King Hussein in Jordan and every other, monarch and El Presidente and Sultan and Emir and potentate in the region are all answerable to the United States and supported by the United States, other than Iran and at that time, Iraq. And so they said, listen, we have to get the United States out of here first. And only then can we wage the revolutions that we want to wage in the region. And so they decided that because America, the 20 trillion ton gorilla here, supports all of these regimes, they cannot get what they want until they get rid of us. And they decided that how to get rid of us was to replicate the war that we had helped them wage against the Soviets in the 1980s. And that is, it's asymmetrical warfare, right? It's like me versus you in a fist fight. Anybody watching this video could tell right now, you can hit harder than me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to try to dodge and get you to punch the wall. I'm going to try to figure out a way to fight you asymmetrically, maybe trip you or something clever rather than just go toe to toe and get knocked right out, right? So this is the deal. They're nobody up against Goliath. So they got to trick America into tripping and falling. Now, by trick, I don't mean to paint the Americans as innocents. Again, what's the problem in the first place? America's the world empire, which you're not supposed to be anyway. But so by tricking America, what I really mean is they were giving the Clinton and then especially the Bush Jr. government the excuse, a crisis to exploit to the nth degree, because the Bin Ladenites cynically knew that the Republicans would cynically exploit any crisis in order to take the imperial project they'd already embarked upon and double it. And essentially the idea was the Americans think that they can do anything, but we're going to teach them that eventually they're going to suffer the same fate as the Russians, because they had proved in the 80s with an AK-47 and trust in Allah, they could bring down even the Soviet Union, which the Americans said, the Reaganites all said that, yes, the Mujahideen war against the Soviets in Afghanistan was part of what broke the Soviet Union. That was one of the straws that broke the camel's back in the 1980s. There's really no question about that. In terms of the money wasted and the morale of their military and everything else, like, it was part of the fall of the Soviet Union. And so they said, if we can do it to the Reds, we can do it to the red, white, and blue too. And so that was why they hit us on September 11th, was to bog us down, to get us to replicate that war in Afghanistan and to lose it over the long term. And of course, we've wasted a couple of $1 trillion. The American economy is a lot more productive than the Soviet one. And so it's taken a lot longer for the plan to come, all the way through. But that's basically the deal. Oh, and I'm sorry, I should have said that about in the middle of the 90s, the Bin Ladenites fled to Afghanistan. They were exiled out of Sudan, and they went to Afghanistan. That was where they declared war on the United States. And now at this point, they were essentially imposing themselves upon the Taliban. In fact, when Bin Laden first got there, he wanted to befriend Rabbani, who was one of the warlords who had nothing to do with the Taliban. He wasn't, it wasn't like a match made in heaven with these guys. They're Hanafi rites. It's a different kind of a school of Islam. And also, the Taliban really are hillbillies, right? Like, this is like if, the guys from Western Appalachia marched in and seized Washington, D.C., was how Eric Margulies put it. Like, these guys are some pretty rednecks out there from the middle of nowhere, come and seize the capital city, run all the warlords out, and this kind of thing. And so that had its own problems in the country, of course, but it also meant that to men like Bin Laden and Zawahiri, it was like white guys picking on black guys, kind of, right? It was like a caste thing, as a wealth thing. Again, Zawahiri was a surgeon, Bin Laden, a born billionaire. And they really looked down on these guys as a bunch of backwoods, illiterate goofballs, which they were, right? But so that really created a lot of enmity between them. And in the summer before September 11th, Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, gave an interview to Arnaud de Bourgrave from the Washington Times, who had been a Reaganite type and had reported on the war for these guys back then. And he had known Mullah Omar from back then and got an interview with him. And Mullah Omar is clearly seething. You can read this. It's in the Washington Times. He's seething, and he absolutely hates Bin Laden's guts. And he's saying Bin Laden doesn't have the authority to issue a fatwa. He didn't go to religious school for 12 years and attain all of the proper credentials to go speaking in the name of religious authority the way that he does. He says, Bin Laden is like a chicken bone stuck in my throat. I can neither swallow him nor spit him out. And the truth is, and as even the Washington Post covered this in great detail, after September 11th, dudes just started spilling their guts and weren't quite sure what they were supposed to say and not say. So you got some actual good journalism done along with the hysteria. And the Washington Post talked all about how the Taliban, in good faith, had been negotiating for years to get rid of Bin Laden. Mullah Omar hated Bin Laden and wanted rid of him, and constantly resented the fact that here he had this fledgling regime that he's trying to preserve, and Bin Laden is trying to get him in trouble with the world superpower and get his, to Bin Laden, the ends justify the means. But to Mullah Omar, he's the means. He has to lose everything as part of the means, and was not part of that game. And the Taliban sent their foreign minister, Watakil, to Pakistan to the UN mission to warn the United States that an attack was coming. And they didn't find out from Bin Laden. They found out from an informant they had among the Uzbek Mujahideen, who, hey, you guys know Bin Laden is about to hit the United States, right? And they went, what? Oh, no. And they sent their foreign minister to warn us, and the Bush government turned them away, wouldn't even meet with him. They even sent him to Washington, D.C., and they refused to meet with him and sent him home. He somehow landed in D.C. and then was sent back. And so that's the difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They never were the same at all. And the Al-Qaeda were imposing themselves on the Taliban. And after America invaded, the Taliban surrendered. America bombed the hell out of their army with B-1s and B-2s and whatever. And they were just, hey, you know what? This isn't a fight we want to be in. And they surrendered the field. And they offered to negotiate their way back into power the easy way under the form of the new American government, which they accepted, not just as a PR stunt, but really, Keith, they accepted the new American installed government as Islamic and legitimate because its leader, Hamid Karzai, wisely picked by Zalmay Khalilzad to be the new sock puppet. He was a Papalzai Pashtun from Kandahar. And his father had been a very prominent tribal leader from Kandahar city. And so he had ostensibly, he had enough credibility among even the Taliban that they would have submitted to just being parliamentarians in his government if America had only let them. Namely, Jalaluddin Haqqani and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, both of whom had by then made their peace with the Taliban. And then when they tried to come in and join the government, the Americans said, nope, you're forbidden from having anything to do with it because of your association with the Taliban. Well, as you know, Keith, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his group, Hizb Islami, and Jalaluddin Haqqani and his group, as they call it, the Haqqani Network, that his son Sirajuddin or whatever now runs, both were major American enemies and major allies of the Afghan Taliban in the war against the United States there for the last 20 years. And hundreds of American casualties and probably tens of thousands of Afghan civilians have been killed by those two men that America could have compromised with from the very beginning. They were their old assets. You could have just sent Milton Bearden over there to say, hey, how you doing there, Jalaluddin? Shake hands. But nope. And I tell the story in my book. And in fact, I crib it all from Anand Gopal in his book, No Good Men Among the Living. He tells a story about, and he's written about this at tomdispatch.com if people want to look, rerun at antiwar.com as well. Anand Gopal is his name. And he tells the story of Haqqani and how Haqqani begged and begged and begged to come in from the cold. And the Americans refused for years until he finally went to war with us.
Yeah, I remember coming across this article that you cite in Fool's Errand, The Guardian, October 14th, 2001. Bush rejects Taliban offer to hand bin Laden over. That was the first time that I really thought of, wow, I always thought that this was one group with I thought it was like the U.S. military with the Army and the Navy. I had no clue at the time that they were.
Oh, and they did that to you.
Groups.
They did that to you on purpose, Keith. I mean, for people who knew the difference between the two before September 11th, it was, mildly infuriating to say the least, to sit there and watch them immediately conflate Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and just say, use the words completely interchangeably as though they are one in the same thing. And then, of course, they immediately moved on and decided to conflate Saddam Hussein with them, too, and whoever else. But that was the game from the very beginning. And you know what? The die was cast the night of the attack. When George Bush, you may remember, you may be too young to remember, but I'll remind you, when the attack broke out, George Bush first sat there like an idiot doing nothing for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Then finally, when he left the school and got in his limousine, they rushed to the airport. He got an Air Force One and he fled in cowardly terror to Louisiana. And then from there, he fled to Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska, where he burrowed like a weasel a mile underground into the H-bomb shelter at Strategic Air Command headquarters. And it wasn't until 7 o'clock that night that the President of the United States dared to slink back to Washington, D.C., where he then got in front of the camera and said, we're going to war against terror. Terrorism. Not Al-Qaeda, even though the FBI and the CIA were already saying, we know bin Laden did this. We knew he was gonna, and now he did. And it was bin Laden. It was Al-Qaeda. Nope. We're going to war against terror. The emotion that you feel when something bad happens. And wrote himself a blank check of declaration of war against essentially anybody who speaks Arabic or believes in Islam anywhere from Nigeria to the Philippines.
Yeah, we have episode 1, about 30 minutes in, of the Putin interviews with Oliver Stone. Vladimir Putin, I want to quote him directly, saying, Al-Qaeda is not the result of our activities. It's the result of the activities of our American friends. When the American intelligence officers provided support to different forms of Islamic fundamentalism, helping them to fight the Soviet troops in Afghanistan. So the Americans themselves nurtured both Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. So is this sort of a case of the U.S. intervenes and as a result this arises, or was there actually direct support from the U.S. to the Al-Qaeda fighters, the bin Ladenites?
Okay, so great question. First of all, I want to say, just as a parenthesis here, you see how Putin always refers to the United States as our American friends, our American partners, always. And this is a guy who I am the first in line to say must be the most throat-slittingest, cold-blooded sociopath in power in the world. And yet, thank God that he doesn't have emotions and is, in fact, such a psycho, because nothing bothers him. You don't ever see the guy get mad, and no matter what corner America puts him in, oh, the Americans? You mean our best friends who we're always offering sound advice to? Yeah, gotta love the Yanks. That's all he ever says. America boosts their budget. He cuts his military budget by 5%. I don't want to fight you guys, my partners, my friends, over and over and over again. Again, the guys, if I lived in Russia, I would wish he wasn't my leader. Fine. But as far as being any kind of true, even strategic threat to American interests, even American imperial interests broadly defined, it's just fake. He does not represent that at all. He's willing to resist on his own frontier, like in Ukraine or Belarus, or something like that. But what do you think, he's going to put missiles in Cuba? I mean, come on. This whole thing is crazy. The whole Cold War with Russia is on America. And I got an article like that, Keith, by the way. It's at antiwar.com. It's called The New Cold War with Russia is All America's Fault. Because, you know, I like to get straight to the point in the title if I can. And that's a speech that I gave last February. So it's like 10,000 words. It's pretty comprehensive as far as like one good, you know, run through of the narrative from the end of the Cold War through today, if anybody wants to look at it. But then, so the point about American direct support for Al-Qaeda is a great question. So first of all, my best understanding, honestly, is that the Saudis took the lead in backing the Azam group. But same difference, right? That makes no difference, really. And later we'll talk about Syria, right, where it's the Turks are doing the lion's share of backing ISIS. But so what? They're our NATO ally running in the same operation as the one we're running. So it makes very little difference there. But at least the story goes, Keith, that the bin Ladenites hated the Americans all along. They wanted nothing to do with them. Dana Rohrabacher, the former congressman, says he was there and was told, quiet, they're on horseback crossing some ridge, and is told, don't you make a sound, because the guys down there, if they find out we've got Americans here, we're dead. And that was supposedly the bin Ladenites, that they already were against the Americans. So, and Michael Scheuer, who, regardless of what you think about him, I think everyone has to agree that he's honest when it comes down to saying what is truly on his mind in all cases, as far as I can think of. And he said, no, he did a real review of CIA records himself, and determined that, no, there was no direct support for the Azam group directly from CIA to them. But again, what difference does it make when the entire program is a plot between William Casey's CIA and Prince Bandar's Saudi intelligence directorate, working with the Pakistanis in the Zia regime back then in the 1980s to do all this, when America is directly putting money and guns in the hands of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani? What difference does it make if they're the ones directly arming Abdullah Azzam and his group or not? It's all essentially one big thing. And so then after that era, when you're dealing in the 1990s, and I cover this in my book, I don't really have where the CIA is putting money directly into these guys' hands necessarily. but America took the same side as them in Bosnia, where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is Ramzi Yousef's uncle, Ramzi Yousef was the guy who built the bomb for the first World Trade Center bombing. And it was his uncle, and it was him and his friends who came up with the planes operation plan, and his uncle implemented it. He won his credibility as a fighter in the Bosnian War, where America took the Mujahideen side. They did the same thing. They fought on both sides of the Chechen War. There was covert CIA support for the Chechen rebels in the Caucasus Mountains in the 1990s. While at the same time, Bill Clinton was paying for Yeltsin's, picking up the bill for Yeltsin's war there. That this is where Putin got his big boost, was running that war in Chechnya for Yeltsin in the 1990s there. So America was helping to make the problem worse and was starting the fire and helping put it out at the same time, with consequences, for those who hate Putin so much, consequences for them right there in beginning his rise, but also in establishing the credibility of bin Ladenite terrorists, leftover Mujahideen from the Afghan war. And then they also fought in Kosovo, along with the Kosovo Liberation Army, as it's called, which was probably more gangster than terrorist, but was, maybe 2/3 one and 1/3 the other at the time. And again, full to the gills of Afghan Mujahideen left over from the war there. In the book, I quote Richard Holbrooke, talking about Bosnia before Kosovo, Holbrooke saying, hey, listen, without the help of these Mujahideen, we would have lost. He says that to the LA Times. And I quote that in Fool's Errand as well. And this is the punchline to that, Keith, is that after September 11th, Bill Clinton, the former president, Tom Lantos, the senator, and Brad Sherman, the congressman, all the Democrats, said, all three of them made a statement along the lines of, I can't believe that the Mujahideen would attack us after all we've done for them lately.
Yeah.
Thought they were our friends. We've done all these things and took their side. But of course, America was still backing the Israelis and having their way with the Lebanese and the Palestinians. We still have our troops in our Air Force in Saudi Arabia, where we're waging an unending blockade and no-fly zone bombing campaign against the Iraqis, and all the other things, supporting all the dictators and potentates of the region, and all the other things on bin Laden's list. And so they were damn fools to think that, just like, and we'll talk about Benghazi probably a little bit later in here too, they're fools to think that just because they're the ones paying them, that they control them. Remember in one of these Batmans where he says, you think you have power over me? But just because you paid me some money? Obviously you need me because of how dangerous I am. So what makes you dangerous to me? Right? Sting.
So Al-Qaeda is the group of bin Ladenites that he created from the Mujahideen. Is Al-Qaeda the modern day Mujahideen? Is that accurate, or is that just claiming two groups are connected?
I mean, if you could say the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is entirely separate. I mean, this is usually, to me, I use the term bin Ladenites because to me that denotes, transnational, international terrorists bent on this specific internationalist type of agenda, where Mujahideen is basically an angry Sunni with a rifle somewhere, right? And so he might be a loyal foot soldier of the Taliban in the Helmand province, but that doesn't make him really an international bin Ladenite terrorist type. Mm. And so to me, the bin Ladenites, one of their defining characteristics is they're almost all Arabs. They're not from Afghanistan. They never were. And, again, bin Laden said he wanted to replicate the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Well, in the Soviet war, 1 million Afghans were killed. 1 million, Keith. The Soviets just carpet bombed the crap out of them. 1 million were killed. And bin Laden's attitude is so if we get another 1 million Afghans killed, what do I care? The whole point is, at the end of the day, the Americans will bog themselves down, bleed themselves to bankruptcy, and go home crying with their tail between their legs. And anybody who dies between now and then, let Allah sort them out. And that was his, pretty damned cruel ends justify the means policy there. It was the same thing with the Battle of Black Hawk Down in Somalia in 1993. He told Abdel Bari Atwan that it was his fighters that shot down the helicopters or the helicopter and were engaged in that battle with the Rangers and Delta there in Mogadishu during Black Hawk Down, and that the purpose was to provoke Bill Clinton, to give him an excuse to do something crazy, to get America bogged down, in bin Laden's words, in a war of attrition on the ground in a place, a chaotic place like Somalia, where we'd have no hope of achieving our goals, and that it would hurt us in the same way that the war in Afghanistan had hurt the Soviet Union. And so, he bragged about that.
So
and
let's
said
talk
that
about
was his motive all along. And he didn't care if a million Somalis had to die or a million Afghans or anyone else. He was putting them up on the chopping block for America to go broke killing.
Okay, so I want to quote Dick Cheney on John King's CNN, 2006. What the Democrats are suggesting, basically, about a withdrawal, you can call it redeployment, whatever you want to call it, basically, in effect, validates the terrorist strategy. You've got to remember that the Osama bin Laden types, the Al-Qaeda types, the Zarqawi types have been active in Iraq, are betting that ultimately they can break the United States' will. So when he says something like that, they can break our will, is that him recognizing that the idea is to get them bogged down in a Vietnam sort of war where they have to sort of retreat with their tail between their legs, or am I reading too much into this?
Maybe. I mean, I think that, yes, in a sense, he's conceding, but in a more general sense, really, that just they think that if they make life difficult for us, that we'll give up, which is not the same thing as really they're trying to sucker us deeper in, which is the real truth of the matter. And, in the very famous September 16th, 2001 Meet the Press interview, Dick Cheney says, where he says, we're going to have to go to the dark side to win this war and all of that. He says, listen, Tim, the reason they did this is because they want us to withdraw from that part of the world. And then he goes, freedom and democracy. They hate freedom and democracy. Right? So, but okay, forget the BS part. The part where he blurted out the truth. They want us to withdraw from that part of the world. Okay, yeah. But I think that Dick Cheney really was the perfect mark that bin Laden thought he was. Because, and Bush too, in the same way, because I think that they just thought they want us to run away. They knock our towers down, we run away. That's their plan. And so what we're going to do is we're going to quadruple down. Hell no, we're not going to run away. We're going to fall for it 200% if we can. And so, and of course we're talking about Dick Cheney. So we're not talking about him being a fool necessarily as much as, you know what? I think there's some foolishness, and then along with, just willful blindness, because he has his agenda that he wants to carry out. He's now got the giant opportunity to exploit this crisis, to go on to Iraq and every other thing that he wants to do. And so it makes sense for him to ignore the fact that it's really not that complicated if you think it through, but to ignore the fact that they were trying to provoke him. They weren't trying to scare him away. They were trying to get him to go big and go stupid. And then that was what he did. And again, I really don't want that to sound like I'm painting him as an innocent man somehow in this. I think it's, 3/4 cynicism. Because after all, it's what Gareth Porter calls it, the perils of dominance. America's the 20 trillion ton gorilla. And after all, Keith, look at this. We're having this conversation in 2020. The American empire hasn't fallen. The Soviets didn't last 10 years in Afghanistan. We've lasted 20. And we're still there at only like 10 billion a year, 20 billion a year now. It's affordable to keep losing in Afghanistan for the American empire in a way that it never was for the Soviets, right? And so from Dick Cheney's point of view, quote, deficits don't matter. We can do whatever we want. There's no such thing as bogging us down and bleeding us to bankruptcy. We can't go bankrupt, right? It's the right-wing modern monetary theory. We can do whatever we want, and there is no real cost limit on it. And so I think really that is his narrow view. And so then that was what made him the perfect fool, right? Was instead of saying, aha, they're trying to give me a kick in the pants. They're trying to give my ambition a new battlefield to stretch it out in. That's why I ought to not do it, because that's what the bad guys want. And after all, think about it like this. Before September 11th, well, screw Afghanistan and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. The CIA keeps trying to distract us with that. We all know the real prize is Iraq. We want to go to Iraq. That's what it's all about, is Iraq. Never mind all this AQ BS, right? But then once they knocked down the towers and hit the Pentagon and had a fourth plane flying at the White House where Cheney had to run in cowardly terror to the basement while Bush ran in cowardly terror to Louisiana and Nebraska, even then, instead of going, oh, well, actually, maybe we need to reprioritize, and maybe limiting bin Ladenite, Sunni radicalism in the world really should be our highest priority, instead of just an excuse to do what we wanted to do anyway, which was what again? Overthrow the minority Sunni Arab dictatorship, secular Ba'athist dictatorship in Iraq, empowering the Shiite supermajority, which did what again? Except push the entire Sunni resistance into the arms of the bin Ladenites and create 40,000 new ones. Now, that's the context of the statement that you quoted. It's 2006. Dick Cheney has just created 20,000, 30,000 new bin Ladenites. And he's saying, geez, you want me to quit now? When Saddam is dead, Uday and Qusay are dead, and I'm not sure the Shia I've put in power, who are allies with Iran, have what it takes to keep Al-Qaeda down. It might be dangerous if we leave now. And then it turns out that, yeah, that's right. And then what does he do? That's 2006. Then what do? The next year, they double down the war for the Shiite side in the giant surge against the Sunnis. And they empower the local Sunni Mujahideen to kill off the bin Ladenites mostly. But there was still a core left. And after they killed Zarqawi in 06, it was summer 06, they finally killed Zarqawi. And what did his group do immediately? They renamed Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, they were calling it. They renamed it the Islamic State of Iraq. And now at this time, this is at their lowest ebb. This was when it was the weakest part of the Sunni insurgency, down to a few hundred men. And yet, so on one hand, it's self-parody that they're calling themselves a state. On the other hand, they're making it very clear what their agenda is. And then, but what did America just do? America just succeeded in making the entire western half of the country stateless, right? The Shiites that America put in power, they didn't want to rule all of Iraq. They just wanted Shiistan, and in alliance with the Kurds. And the Sunnis can all go burn in the sun out west. Screw them. And so that's why the place turned out to be Dick Cheney's prediction, again, after he made it this way, came true. Not just because Obama lived up to the deal that George W. Bush signed, agreeing to leave the country by the end of 2011, because the groups he put in power told him, thanks for giving us all the power. Now don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And he had no choice. They wouldn't give him any permanent bases, nothing. And they demanded Iraqi jurisdiction to prosecute American soldiers for war crimes. And they refused to give in on that. And they knew that that was the poison pill, that there was no way Bush would be able to accept that. So they forced him to sign the agreement. But then what did Obama do? Not only did he leave, but Joe Biden intervened. He sent Joe Biden in 2010 to intervene to keep Nouri al-Maliki in power, the Shiite, Iranian-backed chauvinist, anti-Sunni lunatic from the Dawa party, who had overseen this horrible civil war that had killed upwards of 1 million people during his reign. And in that election, because they actually did create a parliamentary democracy if you're part of the majority Shia, and you're one of the favored parties that has the power and the access, they actually have a parliament, right? Well, in the parliament, in the vote, Alawi won. Alawi, who was a former Ba'athist, a former CIA agent, so the Americans knew him. He was the first puppet dictator in the year 2003, in the year 2004, after Paul Bremer left and handed things over to the caretaker government. It was Iyad Alawi. Well, check this out, Keith. Iyad Alawi was a Shiite and a Ba'athist. So he had all these connections and relationships with the former Ba'athist, the Sunni minority dictatorship, but he was a Shiite. and had a relationship, a friendly enough relationship with the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council as well. So if, and this is a magical if, okay, but if there was one man who's serving as prime minister of Iraq in the year 2010 could have led an effort for compromise and peace and reconciliation between the Sunni and Shia sides at that time, it would have been Iyad Alawi. And then what does Obama do? He sends Joe Biden to tell Alawi, it doesn't matter that you won the election. We insist you stand aside and let Maliki keep the chair. And then so what does that do? Oh, and then this is the same government that's backing the Mujahideen war by that time in Syria, in the words of Patrick Coburn, re-energizing Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was fighting in Syria, and then also coming across the border, which culminated in the rise of the Islamic State, which broke off from Al-Qaeda control in 2013, which, look, the Islamic State was what? It was the Islamic State of Iraq. That's what it was. It was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi's guys, Dick Cheney's guys, the guys who never would have existed if Cheney hadn't have done that. And so when they went across the border to fight in Syria, they changed their name to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And in 2013, they broke away from Al-Qaeda, seized, really consolidated power over eastern Syria. And that was in the late spring, early summer of 2013. And then 1 year later, in 2014, they rolled right into western Iraq and took over the whole damn thing. Mosul, Fallujah, Tikrit, I think Ramadi took another year for them to seize, but they seized all the Baji oil fields and all these things. They seized an area of Iraq and Syria the size of Great Britain. And this was because of George Bush and Dick Cheney's war in Iraq, and then Barack Obama and Joe Biden's war in Syria was what created that Islamic State, which then, as I said, that was in August of 2014, and Obama waited around a couple of months before then in August of 2014, he launched Iraq War III in alliance again with the Shia, in the same ones they wish they hadn't backed in Iraq War II, to then wipe out the Islamic State. And that's why we still have troops in Iraq to this day, is because we're aligned with the Iraqi Shiite army and militias in fighting what's left of ISIS there, the last few Mujahideen, in the mopping up exercise. And so, of course, that means when Donald Trump is fighting with the Shiite militias in Iraq, fighting with Iran that controls them, he's picking a fight with his allies. And he may not know that. In fact, a couple of months ago, when they did a couple of more strikes against this group, Asaib al-Haq, which is one of these Iranian-backed militias. Oh, I'm sorry. It was not them. It was Kataib Hezbollah. It was another Shiite militia. And they attacked them. And the general in charge of the war in Iraq wrote a letter to Trump, I think based on the correct presumption that Trump and Mike Pompeo did not understand. And he told them, listen, the guys you're bombing, these are our de facto allies. We are fighting with them against ISIS. And if this turns into a real war, we don't have the men. We got 6,000 men. It could look like Order 66 over there, where all the guys that our men are embedded with and leading the fight with turn on our guys and shoot them in the back. If America wants to pick a fight with Iran there. And that's the danger. And think of it. Imagine being the general in charge of the war in Iraq and thinking, oh no, the president and the secretary of state have no idea what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia and who's on which side of which line, who's represented by the government in Baghdad, and what our relationship is with these groups and versus the other groups. They just don't know. They don't know. And they're in charge of deciding what should be done over there. It's really dangerous.
So getting to the heart of the conflict, obviously you can keep going back and back to find the origin of, what is the war on terror now. What can we learn from bin Laden's own words? We have the three sources you mentioned in your book primarily. Bin Laden's letter to America in 2001, 2002, his ABC interview, and his CNN interview. What are the big takeaways from his own words?
Sure. Well, and also, of course, there's the big fatwas, the declarations of war of 1996 and 1998.
Yes.
And the big takeaways there simply are that, as Michael Scheuer, the chief of the bin Laden unit at the CIA, put over and over again, he wrote the book Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terrorism. And he said, look, they don't hate us for who we are. They hate us for what we do, which is the same thing with us and them, right? We don't hate them for who they are. We hate them for what they do. If someone said on their side, if bin Laden says, see, they hate us because we're Muslims, we laugh and go, no, we hate you because you knocked the damn towers down, right? It's the dead bodies. That's what we hate, and we're going to get your ass for it, right? Well, they're the same way. So yes, our identity is different than their identity, but that's not the nature of the conflict. That's the smokescreen for both sides. You know, this is about politics and power. And so what bin Laden decided was they could not have their version of self-government over there, their revolutions run their way, as long as America is in their way. And so they're going to provoke us, and they openly explained all of this beforehand. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to provoke you into overreacting the same way we did with the Soviets. We're going to bog you down, bleed you to bankruptcy, and force you out. We could also mention the, sorry, that Dr. Pepper's give me. We could also mention the speech he gave in October 2004, which was essentially, it was taken as the re-elect George Bush speech, reminding everybody that the boogeyman is still out there to re-elect the dumbest mark in D.C. to keep him in power there. But at the same time, if you read it carefully, what it said was, our plan is to bleed you to bankruptcy. All we're doing is giving you the opportunity to kill yourselves. And you're doing it because you're stupid. And he says in there, all it takes, I could send 2 Mujahideen with a flag upon which it is written Al-Qaeda and send them to the furthest point east, and you'll send all your generals and all your billions of dollars racing after them. And the only people who benefit are me and my holy warriors and a few connected corporations in America that profit off the war. Sorry, dude. What is the whole war on terrorism but a great big suicide bombing by the United States? It's a giant campaign of murder-suicide is all it is, because this a-hole gave our a-holes a crisis to cynically exploit. And here we are.
Moving on later into the war on terror under the Obama administration, where Hillary was Secretary of State, we have an interesting exchange between Rand Paul and Hillary Clinton during the Benghazi hearings, where Rand Paul asks Hillary Clinton if she is familiar with any information regarding U.S. arms sales to Turkey. What is the significance of that question?
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't just arms sales to Turkey. We sell Turkey all kinds of stuff. What this was about was Libyan weapons being shipped from the Mujahideen war there on to Syria. And Hillary Clinton, of course, committed perjury and answered in a bald-faced lie to Rand Paul that, why, I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about, Senator, which is a bunch of garbage. And I'm really glad you asked about this because, you know, I hear this all the time. A friend of mine asked me last night about Benghazi and whether that was a big deal or not. And I'm not really sure what to make of it. A friend of mine told me I saw a movie about it. So now I'm kind of angry, but I'm not sure who to be angry at. Well, here's the deal with Benghazi, okay? This is what Richard Nixon calls a modified limited hangout, okay? So a limited hangout, Keith, is when I stole your car and wrecked it, but I only admit to stealing it, okay? So don't hate me for totaling it. Somebody else stole it from me, and they're the one who totaled it. I only stole the thing. Sorry, right? Okay, that's a limited hangout. A modified limited hangout is when I lie about the limited part of the story, and in order to essentially confuse and distract you. So I stole your car, but I drove it west, not east. Now you're sitting here quibbling with me about which direction I took the thing, when the real story is I wrapped it around a telephone pole and I'm trying to get away with that, right? So in this case, the limited hangout is that these men should have had better security at their consulate in Benghazi. And not only that, but the military and CIA assets in Tripoli and in Sicily should have immediately come to the rescue. And didn't. And they didn't because Obama and Hillary let the guys down. Okay? So that much of it is true, mostly. There's not too much to quibble with there, right? Except that that's where the entire scandal stops. Oh, no, wait, I forgot. It doesn't, because it's not just a limited hangout. It's a modified limited hangout. So what they do? They lied about the cause of the limited little thing they're talking about. So this wasn't an Al-Qaeda bin Ladenite deliberately planned attack. No, this was a riot over a YouTube movie that insulted the Prophet Muhammad. And then that riot got out of control and killed these guys. And this is what Susan Rice is famous for. Gee, Hillary Clinton had a splitting headache that day and so wasn't available. And so Susan Rice did all 5 Sunday morning news shows where she came out and gave these talking points about it was a riot over a YouTube video that got out of hand, right? So now that's it. Every last Republican in America is trapped inside the modified limited hangout. Our guys got killed. They didn't have good enough security. No one came to rescue them. And this stupid lady lied about what happened. Meanwhile, what's the real story? The real story is high treason. The real story is the Americans were backing bin Ladenite Al-Qaeda terrorists, the Libyan veterans of Iraq War II, Zarqawi's guys, the Libyan part of the Islamic State of Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And they are known as the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, primarily, and there's Ansar al-Sharia. The British had backed LIFG against Gaddafi back in the 1990s, and then had backed off once the dawn of the terror war started. So now check this out, man. The year's 2011. The Arab Spring breaks out in Tunisia and Egypt. Riots break out in Libya. Really, war breaks out in Libya with armed factions in the east of the country fighting Gaddafi. We still got troops in Iraq. Bush's troops are still in Iraq till the end of 2011. And what are they? They're embedded with the Shia fighting against what's left of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, what's left of the bin Ladenite radicals of the Sunni insurgency. So the war on terrorism, the terrorism the U.S. created in Iraq, but still, that war is still happening for another year. And bin Laden's still alive. Obama doesn't kill bin Laden till May. But he starts backing bin Laden's group in Libya starting in February and March. And so it's treason. And by the time of the Benghazi attack of September 11th, 2012, the war's been over for a year. Right? America succeeded in deposing Gaddafi. He was lynched on the side of the road. They shoved a bayonet up his backside and then shot him in the head on the side of the road. And then after a year of this, they decided immediately, this is the New York Times calls it, Hillary Clinton's bank shot. That was what the State Department called it. This will be our bank shot. Aren't we clever? And we'll take all the Mujahideen and the guns from the war in Libya and we'll send them on to the fight in Syria. That is why Christopher Stevens was in Benghazi, not Tripoli. Why weren't they at the embassy? Why were they at this makeshift consulate? It's because it was a CIA op working with the Qataris to funnel terrorists and guns off to Syria. So then here comes the Sunday Times of London. Hey, look, a giant ship full of guns and terrorists is unloading at the port of I forget where in Turkey. And a scuffle broke out on the dock between the Muslim Brotherhood and the local Al-Qaeda representatives over who's going to get the goods. And that's what Rand Paul was asking Hillary Clinton about, that she was pretending to know nothing about. This massive operation to extend high treason on behalf of bin Ladenites in Libya in 2011 onto Syria to continue the same policy. And we are skipping around, forgive me, Keith, but why? To get rid of Assad. Why? This doesn't apply to Gaddafi so much. But to get rid of Assad? Because he's friends with Iran. And we really hate that. And why do we really hate that? Because now Baghdad is friends with Iran too, because of George Bush putting their best friends in power there. So now that America has empowered Iran in Iraq, well, maybe we can take out their buddy in Damascus, Syria as a consolation prize. See, and that was the reason. And they said so. I mean, Barack Obama said all this in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, that Jeffrey Goldberg says, listen, if we could get rid of Assad, that'd be a great way to take Iran down a peg, don't you think? And Obama says, quote, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're doing, and that's why we're doing it. And Jeffrey Goldberg says, well, what more can you tell me about America's effort to get rid of Assad in Syria? And he says, I'm sorry, Jeffrey Goldberg, I can't tell you anymore because your clearance isn't high enough. Right? Yuck, yuck. I could tell you, but I'd have to kill you. In other words, there's a massive CIA operation of the highest treason in the history of humanity going on right now as America backs Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria.
So, yeah, I remember that article. I think it's titled As President, I Don't Bluff.
That's the one.
So, okay. So Rand Paul is asking Hillary about weapons from Libya to Turkey to Syria, and in Syria they are arming Al-Qaeda, correct?
That's right. And look, they hide behind.
Who are the arms coming from in Libya? Who has them in Libya? Is it just bin Laden?
From Gaddafi's stores. That's from the looting of the prior regime and their weapons stores.
And this is with Erdogan's approval or knowledge?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And in fact, you know, as late as, say, 2014, maybe 2015. No, it would have been 2014, I guess. Phil Giraldi, who is a CIA officer who had formerly been stationed in Turkey back during his CIA career and who goes there on vacation from time to time and this kind of thing. He told me on the show that he'd been in Ankara. I forget now if it was Ankara or Istanbul. Anyway, one of the two biggest, most important cities in that country. And on the street, they're just out there raising money for ISIS. There's no shame whatsoever, hoisting the black flag everywhere, and people dropping currency in as they pass by and all this kind of thing. And the entire effort was just like a replication of the Afghan war in the 80s, with Turkey serving in the role of Pakistan, where all of the Mujahideen come from around the world to Turkey. They fly into Turkey and then they cross the border from there to join the fight. And it was the same kind of thing and went on for years. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with this. One of the best explanations of what happened from someone who knows good and well what happened is Joe Biden himself at Harvard University, where he says, of course, this isn't his fault or Obama's fault. This is all our allies. But he says, look, you know, they're not all moderates. What can I tell you? And it's our allies who are backing all of these extremist groups. And that's what led to the rise of the Islamic State, which is 100% correct. And which, if you go back and look, all the people who were good on this and opposed, there were plenty of people who were good on this and opposed this all along. You know, the great American journalist, Eric Margolis, I asked him back, couldn't have been later than 2005, maybe 04, for the first time I asked him, you know, Eric Margolis, these neocons want to get rid of Assad so bad, but what the hell they think they're going to replace him with? I mean, as far as I understand, the second place most organized force in the country outside of the Ba'athist regime there would be the Muslim Brotherhood. If you got them, you'd be lucky. It might be, after all this conflict in Iraq, you might get real ass bin Ladenites, right? And Eric Margolis is going, yeah. And Lew Rockwell is, yeah, these neocons want to overthrow the last regime in the region, the last government in the region where you can get a drink. You know, they overthrew secular Iraq, secular Ba'athist Iraq, where women with no headscarf could teach college in blue jeans. And now they're going, and these are the anti-terrorists going after all the secular dictators, the ones we don't control. But the fact that they're secularists doesn't help. I mean, if you read David Wormser from A Clean Break and Coping with Crumbling States and his book, Tyranny's Ally, which is essentially the book-length version of A Clean Break, he says in there, oh, yeah, no, bin Ladenite, Islamist, fundamentalist terrorism is a dawning concern here. But, oh, well, it's not like Baathism is the solution to that. Could never be. And so, but wait a minute, though. Baathism as a secular fascist state in the Arab world is essentially a westernized, that's like essentially German politics, right? In the Middle East. So no, it's not Thomas Jeffersonian democracy, but could the situation in Iraq have been improved upon from there while trying to retain a secular character for the state and trying to form, some kind of democratic government and regular elections and accountability without causing a massive civil war and all of this chaos? Sure. And of course, you may know this. I'm sure you do because you already know everything I tell you on the show. The New York Times has a piece from the fall of '03 where James Risen talks all about how Richard Pearl went to London and met with representatives of Saddam Hussein's government, and they offered unconditional surrender on every single thing. They said, listen, we don't even know what the hell the war is about, honestly. But if this is about Israel, we'll switch sides and we'll take the American position on Israel-Palestine starting right now. And we'll stop backing Hamas and sending money to Hamas and any of these things. If this is about oil, we're perfectly happy to negotiate mineral rights with Exxon or whoever you got, send them on over. If this is really about weapons, which we're pretty sure it couldn't possibly be, but anyway, if it is, feel free to send the Army, the CIA, and the FBI to search wherever they want. Not UN inspectors. You send the FBI to search wherever they want, and we'll help you. And if, of all things, this has anything to do with democracy, then fine, we'll hold elections. Give us a couple of years to set it up, send in your international monitors. Saddam Hussein was retired by this point anyway. His cabinet was in charge. He was essentially writing a romance novel and not taking the threat of American invasion seriously at all. That comes from his CIA interrogator. Yet he was essentially semi-retired, wanted no part of even governing Iraq anymore. So it was the Americans could have picked Uday or Qusay. Which one of you likes reading more? Okay, you're next. And they could have brought him in from the cold right there. The same thing with Saif Gaddafi, Keith. Again, all other things being equal, I'm presuming the prerogatives of the empire to remake the world their way and whatever for the sake of argument, you understand here. Saif Gaddafi was ready to kick the old man upstairs and institute real democratic reforms. He was a kind of guy who had a bunch of power coming to him, but was smart enough to know that you can't just run a medieval back-asswards dictatorship in North Africa forever, and that things have got to change around here. And so he was like an educated guy and an interested guy and had done, he was what Hillary Clinton called Bashar al-Assad, a moderate reformer. Well, that's actually right. You know what? Bashar al-Assad is 100,000 times better, who is a murderous secular fascist dictator. But he's 100,000 times better than Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the leader of the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is now called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham over there, which is just Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, the one still loyal to the Bin Ladenites, still loyal to Zawahiri, rather than the ISIS guys who split off. But there's no question either that a dictatorship attempting reform under Saif Gaddafi in Libya for the last 9 years would have been 1,000,000% better for the average person of any town in that country. And they've been at war this whole time. They've had horrible anti-black pogroms. The entire population of the town of Tawerga was wiped off the map. Women, gang raped in their refugee camps. Human beings literally sold in chattel slave markets for $400. You can look it up on, credible news outlets from all around the world have covered the reinvention of private chattel slavery in Libya. Unending civil war between the former CIA sock puppet Haftar versus the Bin Ladenites, the Mujahideen led by Belhaj and the other Islamists, where now you have, I love this. Currently, the war is Haftar, who supposedly doesn't work for us anymore, now works for the Russians, but is also backed by our allies in Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. Whereas the Islamists in Tripoli, now it's the secularists are in the east and the Islamists are in the west. So that switched. Now that the Islamists control Tripoli because we gave it to them. And the Islamists in Tripoli are backed by the U.S., Qatar, and Turkey. Because, of course, Qatar and Turkey are the big boosters of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region there. And so this is absolute chaos that has come from these regime changes. And when there were options, I mean, again, look, the Assad regime, for example, I mean, Hillary Clinton had met with him. Nancy Pelosi had met with him. John Kerry had met with him. And if they meant what they said about we want to see democratic reform and an improvement in civil rights and liberties, protections and all that, they could have pursued that and they could have had some real success. And look at what's happened instead. You combine the Bush and Obama presidencies, you're talking right around 2 million dead. And the idea of regular elections and self-government and Western-style democracy is the most ridiculous thing in the world to bring up to anyone from Nigeria to Pakistan at this point. You got to be kidding me. What is, I was just talking about this with Dan McAdams on my show about they're doing another color-coded revolution trying to overthrow the government in Belarus. And how can it be that democracy means when America's friends win or will kill you? And how can we, in the name of freedom and liberty and democracy and laissez-faire, we have a world empire with a fascist regulatory regime soaking in the blood of 2 million innocent civilians? I mean, this thing is crazy. And what is the average person in the world supposed to think about, the libertarian future that you and I would like to see with more and more and better self-government and liberty for every human in every country? How far back has that whole process been set due to the reaction against all of the blood and all of the chaos wreaked by Bill Clinton and through right now? I don't want to exclude Donald Trump from this. He hadn't ended a single damn war yet for all his talk.
So, whereas originally you, I believe you say in Fool's Errand that on around September 11th, 2001, there were about 400 Al-Qaeda members, and now we have a lot more, at least allegiance to Al-Qaeda. We have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We have places in Niger, from what I hear, about allegiance to Al-Qaeda. How big is Al-Qaeda, Bin Ladenites, ISIS now compared to 2001? Has the U.S. intervention helped at all to diminish Al-Qaeda's power?
In absolutely no way whatsoever. I mean, well, no, I shouldn't say that. In limited circumstances, the closest you could get to something like a victory would have been the drone war in Pakistan, which focused on killing the last of the Bin Ladenites hiding out there among the Pakistani Taliban. However, that just created the rise of the Islamic State group in Afghanistan, because those were refugees from the Pakistani Taliban who sought safe haven on the Afghan side of the line. It's like the Afghan Taliban have safe haven on the Pakistani side of the line. And this is a group that ended up in 2014 hoisting the black flag and declaring their loyalty to the Islamic State, which is, has served as a whole new reason that we have to stay there. Because even though these really are just local Pashtun Mujahideen, they're claiming Baghdadi and the Caliphate and all of that stuff. So that's been, if you read the New York Times, the military says, oh, that's why we have to stay, is because ISIS is still there. When really the best thing we could do is leave them to the tender mercies of the Afghan Taliban, and that problem will resolve itself. No problem there, because they're a competitor for power there. Again, they're mostly local. They're not really a transnational group. So we got to break it down. It's like your question earlier about the Mujahideen. If we're counting everybody who's a Mujahideen fighter anywhere in the world right now, sure, there's probably about 30 or 40,000 of them. If you take, the aftermath of Iraq War III, the people who are still under Jolani in the Idlib province in Syria, if you want to really start defining it broadly, of course, as you mentioned there, you have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is essentially a local group that declares loyalty to this transnational group and its goals, but doesn't really act that way and has their own parochial concerns. So if the question is kind of broadly defined Mujahideen, I'd buy that there are a few tens of thousands of them now. If it comes to actual dangerous Bin Ladenite terrorists who would consider attacking targets in Europe or the United States as part of, what they call core Al-Qaeda, and their, Zawahiri's direction, provoking America into further folly by committing acts of terrorism here and that kind of thing. I think we're still probably talking high hundreds, low thousands of men at most, which is, of course, all it takes, right? I mean, you could say the same thing for the Navy SEALs and the Delta Force. Look at the men that did September 11th, all together with their handlers and everything else from the Malaysia meeting on. You're talking about 30 guys.
Yeah, that's really too bad. I'm just trying to get an idea of, now that we've had the war on terror for 19 years or so. Looks like we have more Al-Qaeda than we did previously.
Oh, yeah.
As a causal result of not only incentivizing people to say, look at more American atrocities, this is why we have to side with Al-Qaeda. We still have the Taliban in power in Afghanistan, and Iraq does not look like it was better off today than it otherwise would have been. Certainly, you had mentioned ISIS took over Mosul. So I'm trying to find a silver lining in this war on terror.
Keith, even from the point of view of the American empire, they don't have any victories here, right? They overthrew Saddam and they won the war, but what they do, they won the war for the Dawa Party, which is no loyal puppet of America. Again, they told America, thank you for winning the war for us, now get out. So in every place they've gone, they've got nothing but losses. They're batting zero.
All right. So, final question here. We still got about 14 minutes, it looks like. Please help me get to the bottom of what is the difference between Sunni and Shia.
All right. Well, I'm not the world's greatest religious expert on this stuff, but this is wrong, but I only mean it in the very most general sense to get you started, is think of the Sunnis like the Protestants, because they'll pick their own minister, thank you very much, and that's it. And they'll go their own way, and they have, traditions as they like them. And just like there are so many different kinds of Protestants, there are a lot of kind of sub-denominations of Sunnis and different schools among the Sunnis. The Shia, in form, again, very, very generically and broadly speaking, are more akin to the Catholics in the sense of having more or less one order of authority in rank. Now, they don't have a pope. They have different ayatollahs who sort of compete for that top spot. The Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq and the Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of Iran, are the two most powerful ayatollahs. But then essentially there's one big Shiite church, so to speak. Now, they don't have priests who, purport to commune with God and all of this kind of thing. I don't mean to make a comparison there, but I just mean in the broadest sense, there are a lot of different kinds of Sunnis. There's really just one kind of Shia. Now, in the world, the Shia are like 20% minority. In the Middle East, it's about 50-50. They are the supermajority in Iraq, about 60% of the population of Iraq. They are, I guess, something like 60 to 70% of the population of Iran. And of course, it's a Shiite religious theocracy that rules Iran. And then they have, the Hazaras in Afghanistan are about 10% or so of the population of Afghanistan. And then there are also Shiite populations in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia. And incidentally and problematically, the Shia minority of Saudi Arabia lives right on top of the oil. And so they are brutally oppressed by the Sunni royal monarchy there, the American-backed tyranny there in Saudi Arabia. And so then this all really matters a lot in the sense that the Shia have not ruled an Arab capital city for 1,000 years. It's been since the Safavid Empire out of Iran ruled Cairo 1,000 years ago, since the Shia ruled an Arab capital city. Now, what Bush has done, if you just picture Iraq and you picture the green line between the predominantly, and the populations were mixed, especially in the cities, of course, but predominantly from, East Baghdad and everything east and south down to Kuwait was the predominantly Shiite area of Iraq. And then, about half the city was about 50-50 in terms of population. Of course, the Sunni Arabs had the power at the top of the Ba'athist Party. But what America did then is George Bush moved that green line this far on the map, this right here, from outside of Baghdad to now including Baghdad for the Shia. And that can't be undone. That's everything. And that means that the Saudi kings are going to keep flinging suicide bombers at Baghdad from now on. And there's nothing that they can do about it, Keith. It took the American Army and Marine Corps 5 years to kick all the Sunnis out of Baghdad and to help the Bada Brigade and the Iraqi army and the Sadrists to finish the sectarian cleansing campaign to kick all the Sunni Arabs out of that city. So they can never take it back, but they also can never accept the fact that they lost it. And there's, the quotes from Richard Dearlove, a famous quote from Richard Dearlove, the former MI6 agent, who quoted Prince Turki Al-Faisal, the head of Saudi intelligence for a time, as saying that we're just sick and tired of the Shia. Or was this Prince Bandar? I'm conflating two different quotes, man. I'm sorry. There's a great one that Dearlove is quoting someone, and there was another one from Prince Turki, and then there was another one from Bandar saying, we are sick and tired of the Shia and them having their way, and it's on now and all this. And this is involving the war in Syria. In other words, we really regret not stopping Bush from getting rid of Saddam. And we're so pissed off that they gave Baghdad to Iran's friends that now we're really going to war against Shia everywhere to roll back their influence everywhere that we can. In fact, that's in the WikiLeaks that the king of Saudi Arabia complained. It used to be you and us and Saddam in alliance against the Iranians. Now you've given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. They have the same idiom as us, only instead of silver, they use golden platter. And so then that was really the start of the redirection policy. There was the Americans chastened and saying to the Saudi king, you're right. You know what? We really didn't want it to be a democracy in this way, a one man, one vote, supermajority rule thing like this. They had gotten kind of trapped into it. Another long story. But by this time, they were sorry that things had gone the way they had gone. And that was when they launched the strategy of the redirection under, guess who? Elliot Abrams was the one who led the charge to say, now we have to start backing Al-Qaeda again and backing the Saudis again to make up for the fact that we just fought the last war, which they're still in the middle of. 2006, again, your Cheney quote. They're still in the middle of fighting the war for the Shia, and they decide we got to turn around and start backing the Sunnis too right now. And they backed, and people got to read Seymour Hersh from the Bush years. The redirection, and then there's also preparing the battlefield and a couple of others that are all right about this very same policy of America backing Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, PJAK, which is a PKK group in Iran, and of course Jandala, the bin Ladenite head chopper suicide bombers in Iran. And they were already tilting back toward the Saudis and the Sunnis in 2006.
The reason that I really want to nail this down is because they do the same thing, Al-Qaeda, Taliban being the same thing. Yep. They will constantly say the biggest terrorists are Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Iran, the number one funder of terrorism in the world. Right. They do that same thing. And if we recognize the difference, just briefly, who were the big Sunnis and who were the big Shia, like, Hezbollah, ISIS, Iran, Assad, where do these big groups fall under which category?
So the Sunni alliance system in the region is America, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Saudi, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, sort of Yemen, although that's kind of up in the air. Oman and Qatar, kind of play it coy because they have their own kind of relationships with Iran. But that's generally the Sunni axis. And then what they call the Iranian crescent, the Shiite crescent, was a term that was coined by the king of Jordan right when Bush started giving Baghdad to them. And he went, oh, no, you see what's happening here now is we're expanding the Iranian axis. So at the top of that, you could put Russia and then Iran, although they're not exactly allies, but certainly closer than we are. Russia and Iran, now Iraq, and of course, then the Ba'athist regime, which is backed by the Shiites in Syria, as well as Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And they claim that the Houthi regime in Yemen is now part of this, and that's why they have to wage the war in Yemen to keep the Iranians from having a real beachhead there, which is mostly a load of crap, but is the excuse for the war there. And so this is really the story. And I'm sorry for the audience here. I kind of jumped around and told things out of order a bit, but essentially the story of the last 20 years is that in the largest sense, the Americans did exactly what bin Laden wanted, which is blowing our own brains out at the same time that we're radicalizing the politics and the religious feeling in the region, destabilizing all of the local regimes that support us, and, further preparing the field for revolution in their future, destabilizing the whole area there and all of those things against our government's interests, as they've just declared them anyway. While at the same time starting a massive sectarian war where America originally, because they trapped themselves into it essentially, but in Iraq War II, they took the side of the Shiites, the side they're not on. And they fought a 5-year civil war for the side they wish they hadn't. Then they announced the redirection and said, okay, no, now we're going to start backing the Mujahideen again in order to roll back all this Shiite influence. That culminated, and again, I point this out because the difference is not between Bush and Obama. When Obama came in and was backing the bin Ladenites in Syria, that was Bush's policy of backing the bin Ladenites in Syria. Bush made the change from backing the Shia to backing the Sunnis, at least at the same time, with that redirection in 2006. It was, still in his first term when he made that change. So then Obama comes in, pursues that same policy in Syria. It leads to the creation of the caliphate. Oops. They were supposed to take over eastern Syria and pressure Assad to the west, but they didn't do that. They moved east into Iraq's west and seized all of that. So then America had to launch Iraq War III, again, allied with the same Shia that they wish they hadn't fought Iraq War II for, the same Shia that they just created the Islamic State to spite the Shia with, right? Only before they overdid it. And now they turn around and take the Shiite side and fight for them against the bin Ladenites again in the massively destructive Iraq War III, which probably cost another 750,000 lives, something like that. At least 500,000 lives, probably more. And so that's where they stand right now is, again, but like I was saying, we have our troops embedded in Iraq right now, embedded with the Shia again, fighting against what's left of the Mujahideen, the same position we were in 2011. And we have a president who not that he wants to fight Iran, but he has adopted this horrible maximum pressure campaign of Mike Pompeo and the militarists in his administration, which is in real danger of getting America in a fight with Iran, which would mean getting Americans into a fight with the men who have been their allies in Iraq for the last 17 years in the Iraqi army and those Iranian-backed Shiite militias like Kataib Hezbollah, the Badr Brigade, the Asaib al-Haq, and the rest of those groups. They're nothing really but paramilitary auxiliary forces of the Iraqi army that Donald Rumsfeld built, Keith.
Scott, I want to thank you so much for your time. Please check out Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. I want to finish with a quote from Lew Rockwell. If something is wrong for you or me, it is also wrong for the cop, the soldier, the mayor, the governor, the general, the Fed chairman, or the president. Theft does not become acceptable when you call it taxation, counterfeiting when they call it monetary policy, kidnapping when they call it the draft, and mass murder when they call it foreign policy. Scott, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the viewers for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.